I flee from a thing that surrounds me and leers through dead branches above.
My friend and I had been out driving, pretty late, probably 2 a.m. We'd been going at least 70 miles per hour, slowing down because our turn was coming up, so naturally, on this 2-lane road we were leaning towards the right. Suddenly we see something tall, lanky, fast enough to avoid the car. Had to be on its hind legs. It crossed our headlights, coming from right to left, like a swoosh, but it was heading our way, and how fast we had been going, it was conscious enough to avoid us. We couldn't describe it, but the silence and the realization that my friend and I had seen it suddenly hit. We freaked out because the way it happened was so quick, unnatural. We were investigating, deducing everything, but it didn't make any sense. It was no rake, no alien, but something. We couldn't put a finger on it. Now here's where it comes back. My friend and I were talking about it again. We're searching on Reddit because my friend made a clear fact that was seen in this community's bio, which was the description of the creature being 8 feet. When we had seen this figure, she made the exact estimate that it was 8 foot standing, based on my own car's height. This scared us but brought us to the conclusion of what we've seen. It's real. We wished we had a dash cam, but like any other sighting, we only have our own minds. It was August 2016. A close friend of mine had bought 15 acres of woods in central Maine, and they invited me to live on the property in exchange for helping them grow a cannabis garden. I had lived there all summer. My bedroom was an old, dead school bus that I converted into a cute little house. We had 7 people total on the land, and everyone was hanging out in the community house, a double-wide trailer. They were watching movies and playing board games, and it was only about 9 p.m, but I was tired from work, so I said goodnight and began walking to my bus. It was very, very quiet. The moon was not up yet. I was barefoot with no flashlight, but it wasn't a far walk and I knew I could navigate with my feet. As I passed by the weed garden, I heard a noise like crunch, 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 crunch. The driveway was clear of leaves and brush, so the rustling was definitely the sound of something stepping out from the woods and directly into my path. For a half a second, I thought it was an animal, but my stomach formed a knot when I realized that the steps had sounded distinctly biped. My eyes had been looking at my feet, but they shot upwards when they heard the noise. Before me stood the creature. I don't remember seeing its legs, probably because my eyes shot up so fast and I was so stunned. It was maybe 6 feet in front of me, and it stood about 7 feet tall. When my eyes shot up, I was facing its chest, and I had to raise my eyes higher to see its face. When I saw the face, I had the wind completely knocked out of me. The creature was whitish, not glowing, but its skin looked exactly like pale skin under moonlight. Remember though, the moon had not risen yet. The form was pretty humanoid, but very tall and skinny. It had no clothing. I saw a bare chest, slender arms, and the shape of a head. I don't remember ears. I remember holding its gaze for a moment, searching for eyes and seeing nothing. No distinguished eyes, face, or mouth. But the face definitely had ridges and contour. I think maybe it did have facial features, but they were so subtle or sunken in that I couldn't make them out. Anyways, the sight of its face knocked the wind out of me. My eyes fell to the ground. They felt forced to the ground. I couldn't bear to look at it. It stood perfectly still while I gasped for air for a moment. I wanted to scream, but I had no air. I felt so paralyzed with fear. I took a moment to do a deep inhale and a deep exhale. I looked at its face again. It still stood, motionless, watching me. I then turned on my heel and ran back to the community house as fast as I could, screaming all the way. My friends suggested that perhaps I had come face to face with a person who was scoping out the weed garden to steal from it. This is common here, and the garden was flowering, so it was really smelly. The locals had definitely noticed. The part I can't answer, though, is why would a robber walk right up to me? I don't know. I consider myself a skeptic, and I think it's possible that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then again, I've never been afraid of the dark or anything like that. I told my friend this story, and he said I should share it here. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. This was probably the strangest experience of my entire life. And to be honest, it haunts me. These days, I am afraid of the dark. First of all, growing up, I've dealt with paranormal things like shadow people, things moving without anyone touching them, etc. And I swear, this is a legit story. A year ago in May, in 2020, my parents were going on their annual trip to Florida with my 3 brothers for the week. My mother asked me if I could go by their house and feed the family's dogs or stay and house sit. Being the daughter I am, I told my mother I would just stay at the house to save on gas. Throughout the week at night, I would bring the 2 dogs inside to feel safer since my parents live on a somewhat back road. Keep in mind, my parents' house is surrounded by trees, and there is a thick tree line separating their house from the 2 neighbors. Well, one night, while I was at the house alone, I had called my best friend, Bailey, to come over and stay the night. We were going to do what 2 mid-20-year-old females do when alone: play video games, watch movies, TikToks, and drink a little. While Bailey and I were in the kitchen, around 3 or 4 a.m., making homemade funnel cakes like the fat asses we are, the dogs kept moving around and staring at the glass kitchen door that led off to the back porch. I asked Bailey to let them out there so they could chill and we would have enough legroom while we were cooking. While we were eating our funnel cakes, we came across a TikTok about making homemade temporary tattoos with a printed picture and perfume. Now keep in mind, my parents have about 3.82 acres of land, and there is the family house, my father's 2-door garage workshop, and a large pole barn. Those 2 buildings are further out, near the tree line. So Bailey and I walked down to the workshop to get into my parents' work office. I punch in the code to the garage door, and we go inside, straight to the computer, and print each other a picture of Kylo Ren to try and make into temporary tattoos for each other. Before I go any further, a little side note: my parents have security cameras all around their property, and inside the office is a television above the desk, showing all of the live footage from the cameras. So while I was cutting out the tattoo for Bailey, she says, "What is that?" I stop cutting and look up at the cameras. At first, I didn't see anything except for a small figure in front of the pole barn. It looked like it was sniffing at the garage door. I shrugged it off and told her it was probably one of the many stray dogs that roamed around the area. Bailey nudged my arm quickly after I said that and pointed to the screen again. Wanting to prove to her that it was just a stray dog, I stood up and looked closer to the screen. And when I did, I saw the figure, but it didn't look like one of the small dogs. The creature was hunched over on all 4s. Its arms were super thin and long, but pointing outwards from its chest. Kind of like how you'd imagine that girl from The Exorcism to be when she crawled on all 4s. It had no fur. Its skin looked tight on its body. On instinct, I went to open the door to look at it, but Bailey stopped me right when I grabbed the lock on the door. Looking back at the screen, at the creature, it looked like it scratched at the door of the pole barn. I immediately said, "What the hell is that?" And the creature turned its head straight at the camera, like it was a scene from The Office. When its head turned, I couldn't make out clear facial features, but it looked like it had a human head with two big glowing eyes. Bailey and I screamed and it bolted, and I mean bolted off screen. Clearly freaked out, Bailey and I hugged each other like that would protect us. Then, something smashed against the garage door, not once but twice. Like, you know what it sounds like for someone to smack a garage door from the outside with their hand? Yeah, just like that. I called my grandmother and told her that we thought we saw something, and to stay on the phone with us until we ran into the house. Once we got into the house, we brought the dogs in, locked every single door, and took shots of Crown until we fell asleep. Now, we talked about this a few times, and I think it was a Wendigo, but Bailey thinks it was a skinwalker. But now people on Reddit are saying it was probably a crawler. Thoughts, anyone? The first experience I had, I took one of my buddies up to the San Isabel National Forest, which I've been through many times before in the day. We drove out there around 9 p.m. and rode some trails out to the heart of the forest, looking for skinwalkers. But really, I was just screwing with him and going for a trail ride. At the turnaround point, I got the cliche feeling of being watched, but was driving with my backup camera on the whole time. The trail was a bit dusty, but I started to notice an almost man-like shape running behind the vehicle from a distance. I didn't see anything at first because I thought maybe it's just me. So I stopped for a minute and asked my friend if he saw anything in the camera, and he described the same thing. We rolled down the windows and listened for any movement outside. With nobody else in the 250 square mile forest, we simultaneously heard a little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, cry out, "Help!" and our heads snapped towards each other, and my friend said, "Just drive." We kept moving back on the trail and seeing the thing in my camera standing as tall as the spare 35-inch tire on my lifted Jeep while running on all fours. When we got to a fork in the trail that turns back the way we came, I decided to turn and head back because I was curious and wanted a definitive interaction. My buddy wasn't interested in proving there was bad shit in these woods, but I was driving. After a few minutes, he starts groaning loud like he was hurt and covering his face. When I ask him what's wrong, I get hit with a sensation of absolute dread and sensory overload. When I was younger, I practiced black magic, and I can say with absolute certainty that it felt like a demonic presence. My eyes were tearing uncontrollably, and I could hardly breathe or speak. At which point I turned around on the trail, and we left for good, still with a clear humanoid shape tailing us out of the woods. He later told me he heard something make a noise outside his window that started like a low gurgling but raised to a loud scream, just like a howler monkey. I never heard anything, but the sensation was overbearing and physically crippling. After getting back on the road and stopping for gas, we found muddy handprints on the rock guards and tire gate of my Jeep. It was spotless before leaving. The second encounter happened a few weeks later. I took some more friends out there, minus the one from the first trip, on what you could call an armed expedition. I was definitely disappointed in their tactical proficiency and weapon handling, considering we were all soldiers, but these were the only people willing to do this with me. There were 5 of us this time, and we were armed with 2 rifles, a 12 gauge, and sidearms. After driving down the same trail and having a few odd experiences, such as hearing movement in the dark, glowing red eyes, and some heard singing, we decided to dismount and walk a footpath. This is around October and early for snow, but of course, as we get out of the vehicle, it starts snowing, almost a whiteout. Maybe 50 meters down the trail, we hear the movement of something really big on our right side in the trees, and to me, sounded like it could only be a moose. One of the guys finds a stick teepee off the trail, and we checked it out for a bit. There were some weird bundles of sticks tied to the tree branches, but we kept moving. The one guy in our group who wasn't convinced and thought these creatures were bullshit tries to be Mr. Hardass and walked ahead of the group with just my 12 gauge and no flashlight. When I hear that movement in the woods again, I call everyone into a circle in case we got charged by a bull moose. He starts yelling, "WTF is that? Give me some light." And we shine a handheld spotlight in the direction he's holding his shotgun. He tells us to go back right now and hurry, never lowering his weapon. I pretty much had to herd him back, watching all directions, and a few times situating ourselves for a confrontation as we heard noises and more movement of something tearing through the trees, circling us from multiple directions. When we made it out of the woods and began mounting back up in the Jeep, he told me that he saw this big, pale, skinny creature just sitting there ahead of us on the trail. He said it had some thin, scraggly hair on its head, and he thought it was a log till it turned its head and looked at him in the light. We heard a few faint screams from the woods before departing. After these two incidents, I took a few more trips out there in similar armed groups. But aside from similar noises and others, like the sound of chains jingling and some responses to our whistling, there were no other interactions. When I would whistle, the woods nearby would whistle back. I want to continue studying these creatures, though I'm back in Florida now. I'm hoping to find some here, as I've read on Reddit that there are encounters in Florida. If anyone has any insight or experiences, please feel free to share them. I've never posted a story like this, so I apologize if I'm not a good storyteller or something. But this is just a recount from about 8 months ago.
I remember when I was 13, I was obsessed with Indiana Jones. I was obsessed with the concept of adventure and finding hidden treasure. In order to fill that need, I would go in my backyard and explore the woods. The woods went on what felt like forever. It was always one of my goals as a child to explore all the way through the woods and into the next town. The next town over was named Jonesboro, and it happened to be about 7 miles away. I hiked what felt like an uneventful couple of hours, much deeper than I'd ever been before. Being so young at the time, I'd yet to notice that it was getting later in the day. It wasn't getting darker, so it didn't faze me. I soon came across something that struck me as odd. I could see through the trees a good distance away what appeared to be a barn out in the middle of the woods. My brain tingled with adventure as I saw other buildings appear the closer I walked. The red barn stuck out like a sore thumb out in the middle of the dark woods. The other small structures were painted different colors and were different shapes. It looked like an old town, however it was scaled down to the size for children. I could tell from a distance that there were people there, however. I somehow knew that this wasn't Jonesboro. Maybe there was some smaller town in between the town I was living in and Jonesboro. However, why would it be out in the middle of the woods? Why weren't there any streets that led out here? I was confused. I walked over to one of the buildings and looked around the makeshift town. I didn't pay much attention to the people that were randomly scattered throughout the area, since my mind was still trying to process what I was looking at. At first, I wasn't afraid, but rather filled with excitement, as it would appear that I discovered a secret town out in the middle of the woods. Every adventurer's dream. However, my delight did not last long as I noticed one of the people staring at me with an unsettling gaze. They were standing a bit away from me, so their features weren't nearly as clear, but it seemed that they were frozen. The person staring continued to look at me, but didn't move. I wasn't sure what to do, but like any good explorer, I came in closer to see what was going on. The buildings were about a dozen or so, and they all seemed to be in various stages of age. Some looked older, while others seemed more new. I ignored the person that was staring at me, and I walked into the town to see other people in random poses. As I saw the other people, I then noticed that none of them had moved since I first saw the town. I then realized that the town was filled with these lifelike mannequins. Their features were indistinguishable at a distance, and now seeing that they were not people, this gave me an uneasy feeling. I decided to go into one of the buildings to see the extent of this out-of-place creation. The building, despite being small, was oddly outfitted to look and function like any other building that actual people might use. However, none of the lights worked inside. I then saw one of the mannequins much closer this time, and my brain began to slowly realize something horrifying. The mannequin had black streaks running down its face from its eyes, which appeared to be empty and hollow. This mannequin had an old leathery exterior that appeared to be worn and weathered by time. The eyes were hollow, however they somehow kept their gaze on me as I continued to examine the oddity that laid before me. Even more disturbing than the eyes was the smile that appeared to be torn but also stitched on its face, forcing this hideous expression of an exaggerated smile. I had seen enough. I was clearly somewhere where I wasn't supposed to be. I began making my way out of the small-shaped shed when I thought I heard something outside. If it was anyone who had anything to do with these creepy lifelike mannequins, then I wanted nothing to do with them. I decided that it would be best to hide and hope that whoever it was would pass. I stood quietly as the sound got louder, and I could hear what sounded like someone dragging something heavy. I peeked outside, ever so briefly to see what would be out there, but my quick peek quickly became long as I saw what looked like a pale creature dragging a person. The creature was long despite crawling on all fours. I didn't get a great look at its face, but I could see that it had a full mouth of sharp teeth with the same exaggerated smile as the mannequins. The person lay lifeless as a tall humanoid-like creature continued to drag them inside of one of the small buildings. It finally dawned on me that these mannequins were not these incredibly detailed dolls, but rather people that had been stuffed and placed around this makeshift town. I could only assume that the creature purposely tore and stitched those horrible smiles to replicate itself, almost as if it was making itself these morbid friends it could play with. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my glow-in-the-dark handled butterfly knife that was more for show than anything. I opened it and held it, pointing the tip downwards as I tried to slowly move out of the small building. I noticed the floors creaked much louder now that I was trying to be quiet. I wasn't sure what the creature's abilities were, or if it could even hear, but I assumed that stealth would be my key on getting out of here alive. It was soon clear that hearing was something it could definitely do. I placed my hand on my face as I held back my terrified breathing as the creature emerged from the small building and cocked its head, as if it was trying to listen. It stood upright, revealing its true height to be around 8 feet tall. The sun was getting much lower now, and the visibility was getting worse by the minute. The longer I was out here, the worse things were going to get. The creature then went back on all fours and started to inspect each building. I had no choice but to make a break for it, as it entered one of the furthest buildings away. Instead of sprinting full blast, I tiptoed out of the building and headed back the way I thought I came. I instantly knew that this was a mistake. I could hear the creature thrash around the furthest building. I sprinted through the woods in the direction I could only wish to be home. The sounds of the creature were still back at the small town, as if it was trying to figure out which way I went. It didn't take long for it to figure out where I was, as I could clearly hear labored breathing not too far behind me. At this point, I had regretted going so far into the woods, especially so late in the day. The sun at this point was now setting, but there was still a little bit of a dull glow in the distance. I was hitting low-hanging tree limbs and branches, trying my best not to trip on anything. I knew that if I had fallen, I was definitely dead. The sounds behind me were so loud that I knew it could definitely see me. I didn't glance backwards, not even once. It seemed to be screeching now, not because it was afraid or angry, but I think it was more out of excitement. The next thing I know, I'd been tackled to the ground. The tackle had knocked the wind out of me and also knocked my knife out of my hand. The creature's screeching began to sound different, as if it had suddenly caused itself great pain. I laid on the ground trying to get my breath back, as I could see my glowing butterfly knife had inadvertently made its way into the creature's ribcage. The screeching slowly morphed into sobbing and whimpering. It flailed around as I finally regained my breath. I got up and staggered my way home as the creature's sobs slowly faded behind me. I made it back home in about an hour, having jogged the whole time. I was exhausted and sore from running in the tackle. I told my parents immediately what I saw, and thankfully, they actually believed me. We called the police and made a report. They weren't able to come out until the next day. The police showed up early the next morning, and I told them where it was in the woods. They asked me to guide it to them, and I somehow mustered the courage to do it. The hike was longer the second time, and I was half expecting the small town to have disappeared, but sure enough, it was still there. The human dolls were still placed across the town, and it didn't take long for the police to identify most of them as missing people in the last 6 months. Even having shown the police the small town and all the dead people, they still found the part about the creature to be difficult to believe. I don't really care if they believe me or not. I told the truth, and there was not much more I could really do. The hike back with the police was relieving. I knew I wasn't crazy, and people actually believed me. I felt that this nightmare was now behind me, and this huge weight was lifted off my chest. That was until, however, when we got back to my backyard. As we exited the tree line, something caught my eye. It laid in the grass not too far away, but I immediately recognized it. It was my butterfly knife. Not only did the creature follow me, but it knew where I lived.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.